Okay. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the fifth in our series of the Hidden Histories of the Irish Abroad. I'd like to hand you over now to the museum's historian in residence, Dr. Maurice Casey, who will be your MC tonight. Thank you, Maurice.
Thanks, Nathan. Hi, everyone. So as Nathan mentioned, this is the fifth of 6 talks in our series, Hidden Histories of the Irish Abroad. So my name is Maurice Casey, and I am the Department of Foreign Affairs historian in residence here at EPIC, the Irish Emigration Museum in Dublin. So as ever, you can catch all of our previous talks here on our YouTube channel. But tonight we are talking about this topic right here, and we will be asking, what does Irish history and emigration history look like when we consider it from the perspective of the Irish traveller community? So just to give you a quick overview of our talk tonight. So we're going to begin with a kind of an intro to the topic from myself for about 15 to 20 minutes, followed by a conversation with our 2 guests, and then opening to a Q&A. So I am grateful and excited to be joined in this discussion this evening by 2 experts whose work has done a great deal to highlight the contributions of Irish travellers and underline the challenges that they face, particularly in Ireland and Britain. And I'll introduce you to our 2 speakers more fully after my own presentation, but I am really pleased to be joined by Dr. Sindy Joyce and Professor Colin Clark. And I also know that many here in the audience this evening have also worked with this history and are part of this community. So I would like to welcome you all here as well. And so after our discussion after a guided discussion, there'll also be a Q&A. So I encourage you to, throughout the talk, drop your questions in the chat box and they'll be passed on to myself, Cindy, and Colin in due course. So to begin with my own contribution. Those of you who've tuned in for past talks in this series will know that I like to talk about research processes, and I like not to just echo what the sources say, but also to describe the sources, to talk about where I found them, and what all of that means for how we consider the narratives we build from these sources. So this talk itself has not been straightforward to research. That has nothing to do with the topic, which I found endlessly fascinating, even though at times the paper trail revealed just how many decades anti-traveller prejudice has existed for. My difficulties in researching the topic really stemmed from my own unfamiliarity with it. And to some degree, my unfamiliarity with this topic suggests a structural problem. I've had the privilege of being able to devote more of my time to studying Irish history than most people, but never at secondary school, undergraduate level, nor in the 5 years of my postgraduate study in Irish history in the UK was I ever prompted to consider Irish traveller history. Of course, so much of my study has been self-directed that the problem is not just the structures of the curriculum, but also my own blind spots. Yet it is the case that Irish traveller history is often sidelined in places where traveller contribution should rightly be highlighted, whether that is in histories of emigration, of histories of Irish culture, or in my own area of expertise, which is the long history of civil rights activism in Ireland across the 20th century. Moments like the 2017 symbolic recognition of Irish traveller ethnicity by the Irish government, and the election of Senator Eileen Flynn in 2020 reflect history stretching back decades of the growing prominence and importance of Irish travellers within the broader landscape of Irish civil rights activism. And there's a growing body of studies of Irish travellers and their history, and I'm happy to be speaking this evening with 2 of the people who've contributed to it. I've also, in writing this talk, drawn from the works of scholars including Micheál Ojeda, Sharon Gamelsch, William Ferris, and Mary Burke. In my own presentation, I'm going to focus in particular on the Irish traveller community in the US. And even more specifically, I'm going to speak about the history of the Irish traveller language, whose dialects are called Cant Gammon and less frequently Shelta, can illuminate this history and provide us with a pathway into discussing it. In particular, I'm going to draw on sources from the late 19th century written by people termed the Gypsy Laurists, And these are sources that we, to use an industry term, might call problematic sources. There's a long tradition of anthropological literature discussing Irish travellers, both in Ireland and abroad, and some of this early pseudo-anthropological studies, what might be called folklorist studies, from the late 19th and early 20th century, are useful as primary sources in and of themselves, but they also must be used carefully, particularly for their factual errors regarding the origins of travellers in Irish society. A consistent and incorrect thread in these folklore accounts was the idea that the travellers were the descendants of an ancient Celtic nation and that their language itself was an ancient Celtic language. Historical research into the origins of the travellers in Irish society is enormously important, although it has as yet returned no conclusive answer as to the specific historical circumstances that constituted the community's origins. Importantly, a 2017 research study on traveller DNA conducted by RCSI and Edinburgh University proved that Irish travellers are a distinct ethnic group and that their roots stretch back to at least the mid-17th century, around the time of Cromwell's invasion of Ireland, to give you a historical landmark. So that is 12 generations ago, or about 360 years. Yet one of the lead researchers on this project emphasized that this is only a date for the beginning of the social divergence of the traveling community rather than their origin, and that origin may indeed be more older still. Importantly, this research conclusively refuted the view that the traveller community emerged only after the famine, and this view had long been used to deny traveller ethnicity. So going back to my 19th century sources, it's not my intention to unmask these folklorists as malicious individuals, but rather to point out that the works they produced were products of an academic world that was invested in fostering otherness and wedded to theories of race. In these early accounts of traveller society in the US from the turn of the century, regrettably some of the only accounts we have, travellers are depicted like items in a museum cabinet, objects to be puzzled over, rather than as people in their own right, who should be active collaborators in research that discusses their community. So we will use these sources against the grain, so to speak, to acknowledge their many problems, while also using them as a stepping stone towards a history where the community speaks in its own voice, and in particular, to chart the history of that community in the US. So, but before explaining some of these early accounts, I wanted to begin our study in Ireland during the Second World War and in the voice of an Irish traveller, or to highlight the voice of an Irish traveller woman. So many of you interested in this topic will know about Nan Donoghue, the woman whose life story is retold in Sharon Gmelch's book, Nan, The Life of an Irish Travelling Woman. Nan Donoghue was born in a tent in the Irish Midlands in 1919, and she was a woman whose life in Ireland and England is sympathetically narrated by Gmelch in this book. The book itself was based on conversations Gmelch had with Donoghue over their decades-long friendship, which began when Gmelch was conducting PhD research on Irish travellers. When reading the book Nan for this talk, I was particularly interested in a moment that took place sometime between 1942 and 45 during the Second World War. During the war, of course, Northern Ireland was involved with the Allied war effort against Nazi Germany, and it hosted a large number of US soldiers. In this memory, Nan Donoghue recalled how we were camped one time in a beautiful place in the County Tyrone. This is the first time I ever seen American troops, Sharon. We had our tent up and it was going on evening time. It was a lovely camp along a big river. Two big jeeps pulled up and the Americans jumped down and came in round the fire. When they seen us so poor, they all took out money and threw it out to me. Then they got up in their jeeps and went on. But that evening, one of the jeeps came back and they left down a box of food. They got it all out of their canteen and they left down the big box of food. We were delighted with it. So what interests me about this anecdote is one, that it's importantly a source in the voice of a traveller woman speaking her own story to someone who actively collaborated with that community in her research. And two, the source also raises the question that perhaps we don't necessarily have the sources to answer. What did the US troops make of this encounter, and did they have any prior knowledge of Irish travellers? So while it's perhaps somewhat unlikely, it would not have been impossible for soldiers coming from the US to Ireland in the 1940s to have already encountered an Irish traveller community before leaving Europe. So to explore that particular history of Irish travel abroad, we must turn to the scholars, the Gypsy lorists, who first sought to trace the origins of a language they believed to be Celtic in origin, a language that they called Shelta. On a summer day in 1876, the Philadelphia-born folklorist and satirist Charles Godfrey Leland was walking on a road near the British city of Bath when he came across what he described as a man who had evidently grown from childhood into middle age as a beggar and tramp. Leland addressed the man in Romani, the language of the Roma community, but the man replied that he spoke another language, which he claimed was descended from Old Irish and called Shelta. A year later, Leland was in Aberystwyth in Wales, walking with a colleague, and he came across a young man who recognized Leland and his colleague speaking to each other in Romani. This they asked this man what his occupation was, and he told them that he was shelking galupas. Leland and the professor colleague did not understand, and the young man replied, "That's what we call it in Shelta. And I thought, as you know Romani, that you might understand it." So this man was himself an Irish traveller in Wales. After his travels in Britain, Leland returned to his native US, to Philadelphia. And on one morning, he remembered that as I went into the large garden which lies around the house, I heard by the honeysuckle and grapevine a familiar sound, suggestive of the road and Romanis and London, and all that is most traveller-esque. It was the tap, tap, tap of a hammer and the clang of tin, and I knew by the smoke that so gracefully curled at the end of the garden, a traveller was near. Leland began talking with this man who he encountered in Philadelphia in Shelta, and this man, an Irish traveller named Owen MacDonald, was astonished to find an American capable of speaking the language. So in setting out the research of this talk, I was drawn in particular to this fascinating history of the Irish traveller community in the US. It was a community about which I knew almost nothing until recently. In a 1971 article by Jared Harper and Charles Hudson, two scholars interested in how the Irish traveller cant was spoken in 1970s America, the authors noted that the oral tradition of Irish travellers in the US records that they first settled in New York, near Pittsburgh, in Germantown, Pennsylvania, and in Washington, D.C. Like many more Irish people, these traveller emigrants were part of the broader exodus from Ireland that occurred as a result of the Great Famine of the mid-19th century. Then in the 1890s, some decades after Charles Godfrey Leland published the book in which he introduced the term Shelta and the limited vocabulary of the language, another folklorist by the name of Frederick S. Arnold came across an Irish traveller camp outside New York. While walking outside Poughkeepsie in New York State, Arnold came across a dark tent and two smartly painted wagons. There was a lone man in the camp whom Arnold greeted in Romani, only to receive the reply, "I don't understand you," in an Irish accent. Arnold then remembered reading Leland's book and his discussion of Shelta and asked this man named Lackey Costello whether he spoke cant and if he could teach it to him. So what's particularly interesting about Arnold's recollection of meeting Lackey Costello is how Arnold took this first meeting as an inspiration to seek out further encounters with travellers in the US. In doing so, he recorded an indication of just how geographically widespread Irish travellers were in late 19th century America. Arnold wrote that since my first interview with the Costellos, I've met travellers who spoke the cant in New York City, in Danbury, Connecticut, in Cambridge, in Boston, Massachusetts, and up and down through my own Hudson River country. I believe that, far from being rare, there must be some hundreds of people in the eastern United States who speak it. They, almost all of them, know more or less Romani and Old Irish beside their own cant. The English name by which they call themselves is the Travellers. They, though born in Ireland, had, they told me, passed much of their time in Wales before coming to America. While Arnold suggests that travellers moved widely, particularly in the eastern United States, in the late 19th and then into the 20th century, the greatest concentration of traveller families could be found in the southern US. The roots of the southern US traveller families can be traced to the initial Washington, D.C. families who established stables and eventually moved to the southern US, particularly after the American Civil War. Here in the US South, they developed a reputation as mule traders, mules being, of course, a particularly valuable resource in an era before mechanized farming. So I was delighted to find a 2013 essay by Bill Ferris, which gave a vivid depiction of the place of this community within the US South. Ferris writes that the Irish travellers are among the most enduring and fascinating of Irish communities in the South. They were led to Atlanta by their leader, Pat O'Hara, and when they arrived in the South, they recreated a lifestyle similar to the one that they had in Ireland. One custom that they became particularly noted for in the US South was an annual funeral procession in Atlanta, and this fascinated their contemporaries. Ferris describes how each year Irish traveller clans would gather in Atlanta to bury their dead, celebrate marriages, and review the year's work. At the end of April each year, colourful tents emerged outside Atlanta, and a giant barbecue was held across a 200-foot table. So having read this essay, I contacted Bill Ferris, who very generously sent me a copy of his own oral history with Ray Lum, a traveling livestock trader from Vicksburg, Mississippi, who encountered Irish travelers in the mid-20th century and considered them to be ingenious traders. Bill Ferris's own footnotes pointed me in the direction of this remarkable article about Irish travelers in the US that was included in a 1950 US cattle magazine, American Cattle Producer. So the author, Margaret Reardon, published this essay in 1950, and in it she described the Irish travelers as a, quote, clannish people, keeping to themselves in all things, save in their business of buying and selling livestock. They are nomads, but only the reckless or daring would presume to call them gypsies. That is a fighting word with the Irish traders. This historically band formerly travelled in covered wagons, but they have now become completely motorised. O'Riordan spent an evening with an Irish traveller trading group led by one Matt Sherlock, describing how the group would pass the evenings as one big party, with the men building up a camp and the stories being told alongside singing and dancing. Marguerite O'Riordan also detailed what she termed the common funeral day, noting that the custom came about because the families are widely scattered and seldom rise. Thus, the funerals of the Irish traders are deferred until the caravan's annual arrival in Atlanta and Nashville, which are the two burial places of the clan. But of course, there is not only a continuity in traditions that Irish travellers brought to the US, but also a continuity in the prejudices they faced, and these could be reflected in anti-traveller legislation. Ian Hancock cites as an example of such a 1927 law on the Georgia statute books that levied a $250 tax on all those who, quote, live in tents or travel in covered wagons and automobiles and who may be a resident of some country or who reside without the state, who are commonly called traveling horse traders and gypsies. So that $250 tax, as you can imagine, would have been quite substantial in 1927. So today, it is in Murphy Village in South Carolina, North Augusta, where a community of Irish travellers descended from these 19th century families still lives to this day. In a recent article on the community for the website Irish Central, Casey Egan noted that the estimated population of Irish travellers in the US lies close to the 10,000 mark. And by point of contrast, the Irish traveller population in Ireland is estimated at between 30,000 and 40,000. And I thought it was interesting to learn recently that after the symbolic recognition of traveller ethnicity in Ireland, there was an event to mark this, and there was a delegation of these US Irish travellers that came back to Ireland for that event. So in many ways, kind of coming full circle on the community's historical journey. So that, in essence, is the history that I really fascinated me in researching this talk on, which I wanted to share with you. But I was just, in thinking about it all, I thought that there seemed to me to be this other historical reality that was appearing on the margins of these late 19th century sources. When people like Charles Godfrey Leland and Frederick Arnold approached Irish travellers and spoke with them, they greeted them first in a language which they called Romance, but today which we would call Romani, the language of Roma communities. And so the fact that these Irish travellers in the US had this knowledge of Romani is itself a kind of a linguistic artifact that points us to a really interesting and fascinating history of collaboration and communal interlinks that I think is deserving of further research, and which I really find really interesting, because I myself am particularly interested in finding out more of the origins of that historical juncture, and an important one in the history of civil rights activism in Britain and Ireland, when groups such as the Roma community, Irish Travellers, and Scottish Travellers recognized the importance of building a coalition. It has really been inspiring in a contemporary moment, particularly over the last year, to see how many discussions on racism and anti-racism in contemporary Ireland have platformed diverse voices, including, importantly, Irish traveller voices. In her book on Irish traveller language, Mary Reeder describes her study of Cant as not only being a book about a language, but one that uses the language as a lens into the world of the community and their perceived position in wider Irish society. Reeder takes this really interesting approach in that she aims not to provide a linguistic analysis of the language, but rather to explore the stories the traveller community told about Cant. Similarly, I think that looking at these early folklorists who wanted to codify and reveal a secretive language, and perhaps improbably against the wishes of their research subjects, I've not been interested in teaching you a vocabulary, but in suggesting how these old ethnographies and linguistic scholars of the late 19th century unwittingly provided us with a paper trail into exploring this little known community and its origins, the Irish Travellers in the US. So before we move into our discussion, I wanted to let you know that our final lecture in the series will finally turn our gaze away from the Irish diaspora and towards the diasporas within Ireland, examining the contributions of migrants to modern Irish society. We will also be joined in that talk by Amanda Nyoni, who is a representative of the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland. So now I'd like to introduce you to my co-panelists for our conversation following that talk. So they're very welcome to turn back on their cameras, and I will stop sharing this screen as well. Great. So hello, I'm going to give a quick introduction for our audience. Dr. Sindy Joyce is a human rights defender, sociologist, lecturer, activist, and member of President Michael D. Higgins' Council of State. And Professor Colin Clark is a professor in the School of Education and Social Sciences at the University of the West of Scotland, and his research explores the European Roma, Gypsy, and Traveller populations. So welcome, Sindy and Colin. It's great that you can join us this evening.
Thank you, Maurice. Good to be here.
Thanks, Maurice.
I guess to begin, what I found when we first met and chatted, what I found really interesting was, Sindy, what you mentioned about a current Oireachtas bill to bring more knowledge about Irish traveller history on school curriculum. So I was wondering if you could first tell us a bit about that.
It's a campaign that has been going on for quite some time here in Ireland amongst traveller activists and organisations here. So we have been calling for our history and our culture to be included within the school curriculum at all levels, beginning from preschool right up into universities, to bring it across the board, across all subjects. And that has been brought forth before the Oireachtas at the moment. So we're hoping that the bill will be passed and will be brought in soon enough. We're hoping maybe next year that will go into the school curriculum. And I think that that's important because, as you said, Maurice, growing up learning history in Ireland, in Irish schools, the most neglected history is our history in Ireland. People learn about us from stereotypical images from media, both media broadcasting and in media print, and it's mostly negative views that they are seeing of the community and not seeing the true history and the true beauty of our community and our contributions to Irish society itself, but also I suppose they're not seeing the true aspect of our importance, I suppose, to Irish society and the importance of our history and culture to be learned by all children within school. You were just saying throughout your talk there, Maurice, about the symbolic recognition in 2017 and the DNA study that was done as well. You know, the myths that we were somehow that we came about after the famine, and that was a myth that was held for quite some time here in Ireland. And you know, that myth, it was plain to see that it was a myth, but there was because, and we can see that through the communities that are in the United States at the moment, that went to the United States before and during the famine, and held on to our traditions, I suppose, and particularly our language as well with that. And I suppose looking at that, the DNA study that was done, you know, some of that can be problematic in itself, in the fact that there was just a small cohort of people's DNA that were samples that were taken. So I think there was only something like 45 to 50 people that were their DNA were taken. And I suppose looking at that as well, it kind of gives the myth as well that now somehow we just came out after Cromwellian times, you know, which is also another myth that is beginning to perpetrate throughout Ireland at the moment, which is problematic. You know, we have evidence in manuscripts, for example, in Old Irish manuscripts, referring to us as a distinct group in Irish society. We were called whitesmiths, I suppose, was the first mention of us in the history books, would have been where we were called whitesmiths, and that was in the 5th century. You know, so just kind of that kind of like with a lot of studies that are done, I suppose the trouble of people from outside of the community doing these studies have these kind of already embedded myths that are that kind of wouldn't be seen to be challenging for them, which would be challenging for us as a community. So I suppose it's just setting setting history straight, I suppose, would be the main thing, and that's what's important about getting the correct history into the school curriculum when it's there. And I suppose that's why within the Oireachtas Traveller Education and Culture Bill, throughout every step of it, from the beginning right up to where it is at now, you had members of our community involved in every step of the way to produce that bill, but also then to go in collaboration with the National Curriculum Council that will be putting together the curriculum, to have meetings with them and to see where it can be put across the subjects. And there has been a member of the community, Minker, that is working with the National Curriculum Council at the moment to get that on the books. So that's important.
Great. Thanks, Cindy, for that overview. Colin, I wanted to ask you as well, just for the audience, to tell us a little bit about the history of Scottish travellers, what makes them distinct, or what makes their history shared with that of Irish travellers.
Yeah, no, thanks, Maurice, and thanks, Cindy, as well. And it's nice to be here. I mean, I was really struck with what Cindy was saying, and also it came up in your talk as well, Maurice, in terms of this issue, I suppose, around sources, you know, and how we use sources and how we translate sources in that sort of sense. And in my opinion, when you go back through the archives of a journal, like, for example, the Journal of the Gypsy Law Society, it kind of tells you, and the written accounts and the written narratives, they tell you really as much about the authors as they do of the actual communities and families and individuals that they're ostensibly reporting on and talking about and discussing. And that, I think, has been replicated and is the case, not just with Irish travellers, both in Ireland and in the UK, in England and Wales and Scotland, but it's also pretty much the history of Scottish travelling people as well, in the sense of who holds the pen, you know, who writes the narrative there. And I think also we've seen that changing. You know, we have seen that kind of changing in recent years. with the emergence of new ideas, new voices, new scholars, new activists who are kind of coming through, as well as the emergence of chronologically older scholars as well coming into the scene, and who are beginning to write their stories and beginning to write their narratives, and importantly, to be listened to and to be respected. And there's been, significant developments in Scotland here too, although not quite as much as there has been in Ireland, I don't think. There's been various legislative and policy sort of changes, but I think the issue around education and the curriculum is, that still requires an awful lot of work here. And the relationship, between Ireland and Scotland is well kent, we would say. It's well known, there's histories going back many, many generations of Irish traveller families, doing economic circuits at various times of the calendar year across different parts of Scotland, and that in itself would produce, interesting kind of mutually beneficial relationships in an economic sense, but also, of course, in a kind of extended family sense as well. So there's always been histories there of intermarriage between different family groups between Ireland and Scotland. And that, I think, is to the credit, really, of both Ireland and Scotland, and the fact that movement has happened backwards and forwards. And it's less apparent when you look to England, which is kind of interesting, I think, and also Wales as well, actually, for that matter. But no, I mean, that historical and contemporary relationship is there. It lives on. It's very important. And unfortunately, though, this hasn't translated through in present times to, as Sindy was talking about very eloquently, the emergence of these kind of voices into educational curriculums, and also the material inequality and the discrimination that we still see both in Ireland and in Scotland and in other parts of the England and Wales as well. That, I think, is where the battle still needs to be done, even though legally, certainly here in Scotland and England and Wales, there have been legal equality now going back to 1989, 2000, and then 2008 in the respective parts. But that hasn't then followed through into the practice. So there's work to be done there.
Thanks, Colin. I was also thinking as well, particularly Sindy, you mentioned about the Irish traveller community in the US as in and of themselves being evidence to refute the myth of the post-famine emergence of the community. I was wondering as well if you could talk about the place of the language within the US community and how that might differ from Ireland, and whether it's more widely spoken in the US or more widely spoken in Ireland.
Yeah, I think that that's really important, because the language itself, it goes back like that. The language itself was formed using the old ancient Irish Alcan technique, and that our language, it gradually developed towards what it is today in its present form under the pressure of contact with both Irish and Hiberno English. So the language has changed throughout the decades, I would say, throughout the generations, I suppose not only in Ireland, but I would say across the board, if we're looking at present day members of the community, we have spread out across the world, not only in USA and Scotland, England and Wales, but in many parts of Europe at the moment, Australia, Canada, New Zealand, we have a lot of members gone over there recently, living and working there. So it has kind of spread out in that way, and I suppose that in itself would influence the language, how it's spoken, and accents, I suppose, as well around that. But also, when you're looking at it here in Ireland, for example, the language has been it declined there decades, throughout I suppose the time of forced assimilation and settlement, particularly during the 1940s and 50s, right up until the 1980s, and sometimes even to as recently as up to 2000. And during that time, I suppose not only was everything else, I suppose, taken from us, our history, our culture, our lifestyle, our identity denied to us, you know, throughout that persecution, the language was affected, you know, and I suppose recently it has been acknowledged that that the language needs to be protected and revived. And I suppose what's really positive at the moment is within the community itself, the language is beginning to become more prominent and more revived. Like, for example, my mother would be fluent in Cant, but I wouldn't be fluent, although that I would be able to understand most of everything she is saying. But I am better at understanding than I am of actually speaking it. And I suppose it's a proud thing for me at the moment to say that I'm beginning to learn how to speak it better. And I suppose my elders would be the ones that I would go to for vertification within that. But also before I would go with, I suppose, those linguistic scholars that had documented our language, because although it is really helpful, that leaves a kind of a paper trail, but there is also mistakes in it that wouldn't have, words that wouldn't have been recognized or used by the community itself, or words that were mistaken, misspelled and misused and misinterpreted as well, you know. So when we're looking at, I suppose, how fluent the communities are across the board, I would say in the United States, they seem to have held on to more fluency within their own community itself. I suppose probably because after leaving Ireland, I suppose they kind of left some of that unique Irish persecution against our community that had influenced and had an impact on the community itself, including the language. But I would say as well, looking at the traveller communities that are nearer to us, like the Scottish traveller community and others, that there is connections within the language as well, you know, although there are two distinct languages, but they're, because of the connections economically and through marriage and through trading, that there would be a mixture of Scottish Cant and Irish Cant within those communities itself. So it has begun to kind of revive itself, but also I would say about in Ireland itself, outside of the community, there are lots of our words that has been used and is being used by non-members of the community who believe the language to be some sort of Irish slang. So like people living in Cork, for example, will say it's Cork slang, and then people living in Galway that would use the very same language will say it's Galway slang. You know, they think that it's unique to a county or a place, although it's spread all over Ireland because of our community being spread all over. You know, so they don't pick up on that connection that it's our language itself. And I suppose looking at our language has been recognised now by the United Nations as a tangible language to be protected within Irish society. So hopefully going forward in the nearer future, we will get much more younger members of the community not only learning the language and speaking it, but also that it will be part of the school curriculum as well when that goes into when the bill goes through and goes into the schools. But also then that once that happens, then people will recognise that it is in itself, it's an Indigenous language that needs to be practiced.
Great, thanks, Cindy. That was really, really enlightening. I wanted to, we're getting fed in some audience questions now, so are really interesting. So I'd like to ask some of them to you both. One is a general question from Gillian Tipple, who asked about what would have been the main reasons for Irish travellers travelling to other areas like the US and the UK, particularly in the 19th century. Was it to escape persecution or for better opportunities? So really that's interesting, kind of about patterns of emigration and what led to them.
Yeah, I suppose there would have been different reasons for different families. Some families would have moved because of persecution. You know, there were times there when children were being taken off the community and put into industrial schools and so forth. But also there were times that it would have been for better economic opportunities as well. So it depended on the time it was, but it also depended on the families as well. You know, I suppose a lot of people throughout the famine years would have moved because of the hardships and the struggles that were going on in Ireland at the time, and then right up into the 20th century. You know, we're looking at a lot of Irish travelled to England, for example, working in the building sites, building the roads, and so forth. And it wasn't unique to Irish travellers. It was unique. It was all Irish people in general during the hard times in Ireland. You know, looking at right up to the 1980s, during recession times, you had a lot of families that would have moved out of Ireland into different countries for better economic opportunities during those times. But then there would have been times that there would have been too much hardship and too much discrimination and marginalisation that was happening to the families that were in Ireland. So, for example, I know that someone like we had an Olympic boxer that was living here in Ireland, and he had to move out of Ireland after winning gold for Ireland. He had to move out of Ireland because of the amount of discrimination and racism that he was experiencing. After holding the flag for Ireland and winning a gold medal, came back to his hometown and was refused access to a bar with some of his friends, and so that just shows you kind of the amount of the discrimination that does happen within Ireland, but also the reasons why some of the families think that they should move for a better life.
Thanks, Cindy. There's two questions here, which I think I'll take together, and they also come back to something, Colin, you were saying about sources. So the first question is, someone looking for reliable sources for someone researching the history of Irish travellers or travellers in Britain, and also Judy DeSouter, who asks for sources for a layperson looking into travellers from the 1900 to 1950 era, kind of appropriate sources for research for creative writing. You're on mute there, Colin.
Sorry there. I'm very guilty of that. I mean, two very good questions. Before I do, I mean, the other thing I'd just add to what Cindy said, this is certainly the case in the situation of Scotland. Some of that migration, some of that movement was of course forced. It wasn't by choice. So you had the state taking children, traveller children, into care and moving them across borders into the New World, into North America, into Canada, and the work of Dr. Lynn Tammy kind of stands out in this regard quite recently, exposing this and some of these historical injustices that happened to Scottish traveller families and particularly young people. So often, I mean, you know, the story of migration is always twofold in that sense, isn't it? It's the kind of push and pull factors that drives migration. And certainly in the case of Scottish travellers, some of that migration was definitely not by choice, it was by force. And I think that that state violence, I mean, that's what it was, let's call it what it was, it's state violence, has never been apologised for. And I think that's something that still needs to be held to account, really. And again, I think through the work of people like Dr. Tammy, I'm sure that will be coming. In terms of the sources kind of question, it's difficult. I mean, of course, we're aided now by the powers of technology and the modern age and the internet, and there's a lot of tools now available for amateur and indeed professional genealogists. At one time, I always used to recommend the book written by, I think it was Sharon Float, around Gypsy Traveller kind of family names. And that was always the kind of the main source book, Sharon Float's book. But now with the internet, there's so many different tools out there to help genealogists track down sort of sources. But my sort of suggestion would be to again treat these sources with caution. and with wisdom, and just do really, as I'm sure you did, Maurice, for your talk tonight, you do as much cross-referencing and verification as you possibly can, and if possible, talk to community members, particularly older community members, to try and cross-check those sources. In terms of the creative sort of side of things, again, you know, the obvious answer there is go and talk to families, you know, get a range of views from families themselves. And indeed, you know, pay those families for their time. I think that's also quite important as well. It's expertise that you should be paying for, really. There's a lot of written sources, of course, that you can use, both novels and academic work. But my inclination would be that if you're sitting down to write a historical novel, or you're writing a screenplay for a film or a play, would be to go and talk to families and pay for their expertise and their time, and probably then back that up with other sources that you can get hold of in both written forms and in both cinematic sort of formats as well. But there has been some really good documentaries done, you know, and not all of them, of course, but there's one that I always think of, which was produced in the early 2000s, called Miro Romapen, My Romani Being. And it's the story of a young Roma poet, Patrick Shonka, and his search for his Romapen, his search for his own self-identity, in a sense, and the interplay between Patrick and his family, the circumstances in which both his parents are, but also his grandparents, who are in rural Slovakia. That, you know, that is just a fascinating kind of insight into a world that most of us do not have insights into. So that some of the documentaries you can get now are really, really good. But the genealogy side of things, I mean, this is where Google and a lot of the tools are your friend now.
Mm. Thanks, Colin. Yeah, certainly in my research for this talk, the pitfall you had to avoid was that a lot of the sources you find online are kind of old theses, which can say things, you know, they're from the 80s or the 70s, and they say things which sound like really neat stories, but then you fact check them and they are incorrect. They're a kind of almost like gypsy lorist romanticization that can watch out.
And the other thing that I found during my stuff when I was doing my original research, particularly going to the Liverpool collection, the collection at Liverpool University of the Gypsy Lore Society, it's the extent to which plagiarism led to plagiarism. So the same myths, the same tropes would come out time and time again, and you would kind of find yourself saying, I've read this before somewhere, I've seen this before, and you would go back and check another source, and the same, literally paragraph by paragraph section would be there. And that's something you need to be on your guard for as well. And unfortunately, there's no easy way around that. You just need to do the work and to root around and be curious, be skeptical, and just verify and cross-reference as much as you can.
Mm-hmm. Thanks, Colin. There are a few questions about the language, but I guess before we talk about the language, I also wanted to ask you both to outline for the audience, particularly just why recognition of ethnicity has been important, but also the limits, because I was unaware before researching the talk that the Irish recognition was just a symbolic recognition. So I guess to talk through the differing forms of that the state recognition is taken in both the UK and Ireland.
Yeah, I suppose here for Ireland, it was a lot later than we say England, for example, you know, and Northern Ireland as well. You know, when we're looking at the ethnicity situation here in Ireland, you look at the community itself and the community organisations, community activists have been campaigning for ethnicity recognition for over 30 years, gone up to 35 years now. And I suppose the reasons for that, I suppose, was because first of all, I suppose the first written denial by the Irish government of our ethnicity would have been in the 1963 Commission on Itinerancy report, where it stated that we were not any different ethnic group to the main Irish settled population, and that we were somehow a broken settled people, and that we needed to be fixed into society. And their way of doing that was to assimilate us into society. And within that report, the former Taoiseach, Charles Haughey, stated that there can be no final solution until itinerants are absorbed into the settled community. And even using that terminology of final solution after the atrocities of World War II just shows you the type of attitude that we had in government at the time, and their policies. And I suppose that was a policy, that policy of assimilation and settlement went on right up into, as I said, the 2000s, right up until recently. And I suppose during the 1980s, there was many of the community that were pushed into urban areas, and now when you look at the statistics, over 80% of our community live in urban areas in Ireland, and we were originally more a rural people, but that was because of the forced settlement, moving from being forced from traditional camps into cities and towns, and to avail of the accommodation that would have been provided by the local councils through halting sites. So we're looking at the first halting site built in Ireland was in 1968, so 5 years later after the report. So the sites were meant to be temporary, and they were meant to be temporary into ghettos, and it's written into the report, to get us used to being in one place for longer periods of time before that we could be moved from there into standard settled housing. And I suppose throughout all that, with the hardships, those temporary sites, sites that were supposed to be temporary, are still operating with generations of families living on them without proper services and sanitation being provided. So you're looking at kind of like all the health issues that surrounds that, with the lack of access to some sites have lack of access to running water, for example, flushing toilets, electricity, access to these basic human rights services that are not provided up until today. And part of the ethnicity campaign was that if we could get recognised for who we are as an Indigenous ethnic community, well then we could be perhaps provided with those basic human rights that we deserve. But when we look at all throughout that campaign, and we have to kind of look at the members that came before us, some of them that are not here today, and that didn't get to see that symbolic recognition, that had been fighting for it for years, And in 2017, when the symbolic recognition came, it was a time of, at that time, it was a time of excitement for us. It was a time that now we have our recognition, but looking at that, what it did on the one hand is it I suppose gave us that confidence as a community to stand up and fight more for our basic rights. But also on the other hand, it gave the Irish population a sense of who we are as a community, and a sense of wanting to acknowledge us more, and acknowledge the discrimination and racism that we have faced in Ireland. But looking at that, when we look at it in a legal standpoint, it's not legislation, it's not legalized, it's just a symbolic recognition, and it hasn't been through the courts or been tested. So I think that there needs to be a test case for that, and because at the moment it's not, it's good in a symbolic way. It's absolutely fantastic, but I suppose like a saying I always say is that if you're hungry, you can't eat symbolic bread, and that would be a similar stance that I would take with ethnicity recognition as well.
Thanks, Cindy. I suppose as well, because we are running low on time, and I do want to make sure that all the audience get to ask their questions. So I'll come to the language questions before as well. I want us also to get a chance to talk about contemporary challenges faced and to talk about sort of paths forward, and particularly what people outside the community can do to help. And so the language questions are essentially, there's two of them, and one is looking for kind of courses or tools to recommend for someone looking to learn Cant. And Helen Keogh also asks a question about the difference between dialects of Cant and whether, I wasn't sure of this, are they Cant, Shelta and Gammon, are these separate dialects, or are they similar words or synonymous words, and where can Helen go to learn any of these languages? And I suppose that kind of links into a question about, I suppose any kind of attempt to learn Cant from someone beyond the community would have to begin with developing a relationship of trust with the community. But yeah, so let's speak to those questions of learning the language. And
yeah, I suppose the first thing that I would say would be to contact the traveller organisations that would have a wealth of sources on the language itself, but that would also give the person the opportunity to meet with the community members themselves, and to build up rapport and trust with the community itself. And yeah, so I would say probably that would be my first point of contact to go to if you wanted to learn the language. And what was the second question, Maurice?
Well, the differences between the dialects, yeah.
So I suppose for here in Ireland anyway, it's that we would never call the language Shelta. It just wouldn't be a name that we would call it as a community at all. That would be seen as just the academic term that would be used. So here it would be called either the Gammon or the Cant, or in our own language it would be Minkatari. And the dialects then, it would be similar to the Irish language, how Kerry would be a different dialect to Donegal, for example. The Cant and the Gammon would be like that as well, depending on the regional area, more likely.
Thanks. So then let's, we're coming up to the 7:30. So let's talk then, because it's a broad topic, I guess, about contemporary issues faced by the community. And Colin, we spoke as well last Friday. We spoke about the hate crime that the community faces. And so I guess to talk about that, the kind of crimes that travellers are victims of in the UK, and what might be done to sort of better highlight those and challenge them.
Mm. Well, I mean, this takes us back to the legal recognition kind of issue. So in England, Wales, kind of Scotland, sort of it goes back to 1989, Commission for Racial Equality against Dutton. So that was the legal kind of recognition, of effectively English Romani gypsies. Then in 2000, you had the Punch Retail case, again taken by the Commission for Racial Equality against Punch Retail. So that was the legal recognition of Irish travellers in England. And then in 2008, we had a case in Scotland that myself and many other people contributed to, that basically pushed an open door, really, for the legal recognition of Scottish travelling people. And when you have that legal protection, which is distinct to what Cindy was talking about, I mean, as she said, the symbolic act doesn't put bread on the table, kind of thing, So with that legal protection, you are able to, go to the authorities, the police and others, and say, look, I've been discriminated against, and here's the evidence of that. Please take this forward. And of course, what's interesting is that even with that legal protection, hate crime is still very much kind of evident. You can see it in the graffiti that's written on walls when travellers settle in houses. You can see it when the bairns come home from school and say they've been called names in the playground. You can see it when men go for jobs and get turned down for jobs because of perhaps their surname or where they reside, and so on and so forth. So I think, despite decades now of equalities legislation, it does seem to be the case that somehow there's some kind of element there that this doesn't translate into effective policing and criminal justice protection of the communities themselves. And I just find it odd that there is this disjuncture between, we've seen a lot of it. I mean, I'm thinking here about the Pontins case that we've seen recently, again, based on surnames effectively. You see it in the Channel 4 programme, the truth about traveller crime. There's many examples there where there's been a license given almost to hate crime, to anti-traveller, kind of rhetoric in public domains amongst people who really should know better. But it's about securing viewing figures and securing attention for the agenda that they're particularly drawing on. But there is this disjuncture between the communities as victims of hate crime, and then the more broad perception of the communities as being, enactors of crime, as being criminal almost at birth by virtue of your surname and who you're one of and where you were born, sort of thing. So I think that disjunction needs to be kind of corrected. There is a major study going on at the moment, a £1 million Economic and Social Research Council study that's been led by Professor Coretta Phillips at the London School of Economics, which is hoping and aiming to do exactly that, to turn the tide and to turn the tide of perceptions, and to seriously examine the impact of hate crime on traveller, Gypsy and Roma families, and hopefully that will come good. But it's a challenge. It's a serious challenge.
Thanks, Colin. On linked to that question, Sindy, I wanted to ask. I mean, looking at the kind of landscape of Irish civil rights activism, there's a real rising to prominence of Irish traveller women voices like yourself, and of also Irish LGBTQ plus travellers. I just wondered, who should we be listening to? What organisations, what people do you think in the community are really contributing and really worth listening to at the moment?
I suppose I think that it's fantastic that I suppose that intersectionality is being viewed within the community, and I think that that's really prominent in our community at the moment, is the intersectionality, and not only I suppose the acceptance of it, but also the celebration of that within our community. And I think that that's a really positive step that's happening at the moment. Not only, I suppose, are we looking at women and girls issues, we're looking at LGBTQI communities. We're looking at autistic members of the community, for example, and different disabilities, and all those I suppose intersectionalities to be celebrated. And I think that people need to listen to, I suppose, those voices that are kind of new to the scene of activism, I suppose, that wouldn't have been as visible, I suppose, before. I think that they need to be listened to, particularly members that would have been more marginalised voices, even within the community itself, before, that now that they need to be listened to. But also, I suppose, looking more at, I suppose, not only, I suppose, in a broad sense, we have many organisations in Ireland. We have the national organisations, but also we have small local organisations that are doing fantastic work as well. So looking at different regional areas as well. Because I suppose one of the experiences is that it seems that we have the national organisations that are based in Dublin. And although they're doing fantastic work, but many of their experiences of travellers living in Dublin wouldn't be the same experiences of travellers living, for example, in Kerry, for example, or in different more rural isolated and marginalized areas than what the urban now scene would be. So I suppose looking at those voices and looking at the intersectionality, I think, is important for that and for the emergence of those voices to be heard.
Thanks, Cindy. And I think that's a fitting message for us to really bring this evening's talk to a close. In finishing, I wanted to really thank you both. It's been enlightening for me. I found it fascinating. I'm sure our audience has found it really interesting as well. And of course, I wanted to thank our audience for spending their Thursday evening with us on a sunny day here in Ireland. But I think that this is a really important discussion, and I hope that more people who perhaps this is their first time engaging with the traveller history or thinking about coalition building with traveller communities, I hope that you go on to continue to do so. And I also want to, as ever, thank you all those in particular who registered and who did so with a donation to the movement of asylum seekers in Ireland, who as well have done a lot of work in terms of coalition with traveller communities also in Ireland and recognising that intersectionality. So that brings tonight to an end. So thanks everyone for joining us, and hopefully we'll see you at our next talk then towards the end of May. Thank you.
Thank you.